But if I had access to a bathtub, I would certainly make use of salt and borax in twice-a-day morning and evening baths, because I really miss that, but I don't have access to it. So what the creatine supplement does, it does not eliminate my desire to use the borax with salt. It merely removes the necessity of consuming it, which is a pretty good deal because the digestive system is geared for organic material. Now, when I use the word organic, I'm not using it in the common sense. I'm using it in the chemistry sense. In other words, compounds that are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and anything else is extra, optional, such as nitrogen and sulfur. While inorganic has to do with salts, such as sodium chloride, sodium bicarbonate, sodium borate. Those are considered inorganic because they don't have carbon associated with them, or they don't have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, more fully speaking. So the necessity to consume salt with borax is really just a condition of being homeless more than anything. Even soaking in a jacuzzi that's chlorinated with a salt system is halfway there, because they put salt in water to a substantial degree. It tastes salty, and pass an electrical charge through the water as it passes through the filtration system to convert some of the chloride ion of salt dissolved in the water into chlorine. And it works very well, and I highly endorse it. I think it's probably the best means of chlorinating a swimming pool or a jacuzzi there is. Unfortunately, not too many people utilize it, but the 24-Hour Fitness over on, I forget the street, in Carmel Mountain area, they make use of a salted jacuzzi, and it's pretty cool. It may lack the borax, but at least it has the salt, and that is very cool, in fact. That's why the beach is so popular, because of salt present in the ocean. It's what our body needs, and borax is just an emphasis of the alkalinity of sodium to help boost the alkalinity of salt in case the person is sick, like I am, from multiple antifreeze poisonings. It tends to acidify the system because of the candida overgrowth. Creates a lot of lactic acid and other acids that it's hard-pressed by my body to maintain alkalinity. So previously, what I would do is consume lots of calcium and magnesium in order to alkalize. And that's good, but that's internalized. That's internal consumption. The skin requires salts, inorganic salts, compounds, to feed itself because the skin cannot digest anything. And so anything absorbed through the skin has to be pre-digested, and salt is, because it was never made into something complicated involving organic compounds such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, which is what the intestinal tract is designed to handle, along with the stomach, are complex, complicated organic compounds such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, molecules, sugar, protein, whatever, and break it down. And what I find is that because of the antifreeze poisoning, I'm off the path of Dharma. It's really difficult increasingly as the time goes by to maintain my being on track for evolutionary development instead of stagnating. And stagnating is the worst thing for a yogi, is to stop the accelerated process of growth. I mean, most people will take 2 million years to reach enlightenment because they're following the path of nature. And yoga is, or a yogi, the intention is to accelerate the process of evolution, not slow it down. Alcoholism slows it down, and thus butt fucking slows it down, since that creates alcohol in the colon, or in the rectal area, by putting sugar there from the semen, and the yeast in the colon that's already there in everybody, even a healthy colon has it, converts that sugar into alcohol, and it bypasses the liver. So it's actually a form of alcoholism to engage in butt fucking. And the only risk or danger of butt fucking from the standpoint of yoga is that it adds alcohol to one's diet, and that's the last thing I want to do. Having been born of an alcoholic, the last thing I want to do is encourage it. I have to discourage it. I have to fight it, my tendency of becoming a drunk. Well, sex in general is a loss of life force, and the only way to open up a major chakra is to conserve the life force. So my biggest challenge since the age of 19 is to believe in myself without sex being utilized to bolster my self-image, my self-respect. And I've noticed that when the transition period occurs, when the crown chakra opens up and is undergoing the process of stabilizing its open condition, there is such an intensity of vulnerability, it's uncanny. It makes it possible to increase self-doubt and feelings of self-done worth, which of course is inverted egotism, best exemplified by Woody Allen style of humor, which is analogous to self-deprecation. Anyway, it's the most, and this is why Charlie Lutz managed to reach enlightenment the first time on Maldek, which is now a comet belt, no longer a planet, because I was there to believe in him when nobody else did. In this lifetime, he had his wife, Helen Lutz, who believed in him, and oh boy, did she make it known to him in no uncertain terms that you're going to go back into your room and finish your meditation, because I was there. I heard you promise the Maharishi you would keep up with your meditation twice a day, and you're not going to give up on it like you are now, because he was going through unmitigated fear, unstressing. 24/7, he was in a state of heightened fear, and there was no way to avoid it. And he had 2 years of being alone with his meditation, with Maharishi not around to share Maharishi's grace with Charlie to avoid that kind of suffering. But it was his own cross to bear, and he bore it. And when Maharishi returned, he thanked Charlie. The minute he got off the plane, he did, without Charlie saying anything, before he even left the tarmac, because in those days that's how you got onto planes. You had to walk the tarmac to get onto one. He said, it's very, very good. You've done what I have asked. You've been faithful to your meditations. And Charlie said, oh, yeah. He wasn't very impressed because of what he said about 3 days later, all of heaven broke loose on him, and he couldn't complain about that. Which I surmise was probably the grace of God due to the presence of Maharishi returning after 2 years. But Charlie made it possible for that grace to occur, because if he hadn't kept up with his meditation, it probably would not have happened when Maharishi would return, and maybe he never would return. Maybe he was waiting for Charlie to become ready for any kind of grace to boot him over the last edge, because as humans, we're not really capable of going the whole distance. And meditation helps go 99% of the way. But we still need the grace of somebody who's enlightened to get us the other 1%. And that's predicated on devotion. And Charlie Lutz was almost ready to give up his devotion to Maharishi, and his wife forbade him. And without his wife, Charlie would be nobody, so he stuck to his wife's preventative program, because she was very incredibly devoted to Maharishi. And Charlie needed somebody like her who had absolutely no self-doubt whatsoever as to the efficacy of being devoted to TM, because it did make all the difference in their lives, and she was not going to allow Charlie to ignore that, how good it is. But it took, somebody on the outside, because she wasn't going through what Charlie was going through. She had her own karma, and at that time, it hadn't really reached her, so she was in a position to really bolster Charlie and not be swayed by her own unstressing, which came later, I think, in the 80s, when she acquired hepatitis A, I think it is. Anyway, so what I find about the borax is that it's a means and a method to bolster Dharma, to bolster the strength and the reserve to pursue Dharma. And because of that, it's a crutch, because it's not really our devotion, it's kind of forced, the use of borax. And that might be why nobody likes it and calls it a poison, because it forces spirituality upon the person. Once they choose to use borax, it becomes automatic to become spiritually endowed with devotion. Once the decision to make use of it and it is acted upon. And most people are not spiritual. Most people don't want to have anything to do with spirituality. They don't want to have to deal with facing their liabilities and live them and live through them. And, all the liabilities, all the things they've done to other people that they don't want to have to experience themselves. How many people do to themselves first what they do to other people? This is why I have a great deal of respect for a physician, a Swiss physician who lived shortly before the Elizabethan era, before Elizabeth I took the throne, before she was born. There was a Swiss physician by the name of Paracelsus, he called himself. His birth name was Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, but he took a simpler name, Paracelsus. And he experimented with the formation of sulfur drugs for his patients, and he always took his experiments and consumed them personally before he gave them to his patients, because he wanted to be fully responsible for his actions. And as a scientist, that's admirable. Now, I can't do that, studying free energy, or else I'd electrocute myself to death. It's absurd to do something like that. And the only circuits I've ever built are bionic circuits and psionic circuits, because that are united to the body as part of the circuitry. So they are definitely, all of them, biocircuits, or bionic circuits, but some of them were actually psionic. No, they were all psionic, actually. So they were a combination of psionic and bionic, but because I fully believe that was the best way to do it, was to take personal responsibility. But with free energy, I can't. I'm actually, so it's actually a block to my path of yoga that I pursue this, because I cannot take personal responsibility, because I know what will happen, the risk of the stuff blowing up in my face is too great. I've seen it happen under simulation over and over again, and I don't mistrust my simulations, not like most people who don't think free energy exists anyway. They don't believe a word I say about taking the risk of blowing up the circuit if they should start to want to really do things the proper way instead of poo-pooing it and thinking that it's nonsense and against the laws of physics, blah, blah, blah. They have no idea what they have in store for them because they don't believe me. Anyway, so it's adharmic for me to pursue free energy study. It's very pleasant and very rewarding, but it has nothing to do with my evolutionary development. It doesn't help it one bit, and it just gets in the way because it's a distraction. But it's a pleasant distraction, and I pursue it only because out of public service to educate people. I'm not getting very far with that process of educating people because they don't believe a word I say. So anyway, so I was just making an example. So really my personal nudity in the past was probably closer to my dharma, provided I don't practice nudity the way most people do. Most people, they define nudity in terms of sexuality, and in fact, the phrase getting naked means to them, oh, it's time for sex, because that's the only thing they see nudity good for, is hedonism. And that is a branch of nudism among nudists practiced by hedonists who think it's okay, an opportunity for elevated sexual activity, when in fact, from the standpoint of yoga, the opposite should take place. It's supposed to be a substitute for sexual activity, not an encouragement. But most people are not nudists from childhood on. They're not programmed in how to think about it as a child would think about it. They instead think about it in terms of adult perspectives rather than child perspectives. And so they misinterpret nudity as, oh, an opportunity for sex, a heightened opportunity, and an encouragement for sex, which is not the way I look at it because I started when I was 15. In fact, when I started to fast on fruits and vegetables when I was 17 for 2 years, I lost all sexual activity, including masturbation. So, and I lost all desire to be a nudist as well. So I had transcended nudity to the point that I wanted to put clothes on because I didn't want to think about my genitals, because I didn't want to have any encouragement whatsoever. Despite the fact that I was already putting off masturbation by being a nudist, which was a good thing in my case because I'm not that. I'm not born with a strong physiology. I'm born with alcoholic's physiology, so I don't have a whole lot of stamina to waste in sex. And nudity gives me the joy of sex without the sex. And that's really the purpose of nudity. And that's the joy that children experience, is the joy of sex without the sex when they are nudist children. That's the whole point. In other words, nudity is a form of motivation because we get in touch with our sexuality. In the case of children, it's a potency of sexuality because they're prepubescent, so it's not fully developed sexuality, but it's sexuality nonetheless, even though it's the potentiality for sexuality without it being a heightened opportunity for sexuality from the standpoint of adults who are sexually active, post-adolescence or post-mid-adolescence or whatever, however you want to call it. No, just adolescence and post. But pre-adolescence, it's a different interpretation. Nudity is seen as an opportunity for becoming motivated by one's potency for sexuality or potentiality for sexuality. And how you use that motivation is entirely up to you. So if you use it for increased sexual activity, that's your choice. And that's the way our culture defines nudity, as sexuality active, And that's why they make it illegal, or they make it usually illegal from a city ordinance standpoint, because city ordinance can get away with being more strict. But state law tends to be more lenient, and so it usually allows it, provided sexual activity is not, or eroticism, excuse me, if lewdness is not engaged, such as a boner. That's the way this California state law is interpreted by judges from the 1950s. When I went to the law library at UCLA, it was very obvious to me that nudity alone is not illegal, even though the police and the media misinform the public and misrepresent the nudity laws because they want more business for the courts. Courts make money every time a case goes through, so on behalf of the county in which those courts reside. So it's in the police best interest to misrepresent the state law, because the penalty is greater, and that means imprisonment, and that means more money for the private prison industry. So there's a lot of fraud going on in the so-called halls of justice now that did not go on in the 50s, because the police would still arrest people because, people complain and they want people to be nudists to be arrested. So the police had no choice under the peer pressure of the community to arrest people, but then the judges were there to stop it from going any further. I'd read the court case from the 50s, and the judges will go, "Hey, did the person do anything else, commit any other crime while they were naked? No? Okay, release them." And that was the end of that. But now that doesn't happen. Even the lawyers are in on the scam and keep their mouth shut and don't try to support the correct interpretation of the state law. Instead, they misinterpret it by allowing themselves to fail. Because I even asked a lawyer, "Well, can you guarantee my absolution from being held to be guilty of doing some crime of nudity," when I knew in my heart that before I learned about the law that it was not illegal. It could not be illegal if all you did was be naked, and you didn't do anything else. You acted like the emperor with no clothes, as if you thought you were clothed, because you should not. Nudists don't act any differently when they're naked as opposed to when they're clothed, because they know better. But most of humanity are programmed to think the opposite. They don't know any better. They think, "Oh, it's time for sex." And the lawyer could not guarantee a win. And so I knew he wanted $5,000 and couldn't guarantee, so screw him. I don't need that. And my ex managed to find somebody else who was a nudist and a lawyer who knew the correct interpretation and taught it to me and confirmed what I already knew in my heart. So the only reason why I study free energy, because I knew in my heart that it was true, and now I know it's true. I actually confront liars who lie to my face in order to protect conservation of energy as the sole interpretation of physics of energy, which is not the only interpretation of energy. It's the thermodynamic interpretation of burning wood or fossil fuels. It has nothing to do with electricity in its essential nature. It has to do with the ramification of electricity passing through wires and coils, heating up those wires and coils, but it has nothing to do with the intrinsic nature of electricity, which is nonlinear in its essential nature, while thermodynamics and the heating of coils is entirely linear. A equals B. That's a very linear situation. But when A does not equal B, or is not even proportional to changes in B, then, in other words, your input can vary by a fraction of a unit of measurement, while your output can be anything between 0 and infinity as your non-reachable limits. That's a lot of latitude for an output. And the proportionality, of course, changes. A is no longer equal to B. A is not even proportional to B. Input is not proportional to output. So it's a completely different situation to take electricity on its own terms and forget about the limitations imposed on the population's mentality of thermodynamic, namely fossil fuel industry encouragement from a standpoint of perspective. Anywho, shows you how wrapped up I am that I can't help but segue into a different topic without even sticking to the topic. But I guess I said everything that needs to be said. And that's the only reason why I'm segueing. But it does cover everything that I'm engaging in. And it's a contradiction then for me to pursue free energy. But actually, the study of free energy is the study of electricity in fully engaging both free energy and non-free energy in the pursuit of that study is the study of electricity as it manifests as consciousness at its first sprouting of manifestation from the absolute. So it's borderline enlightenment. It's borderline dwelling on the absolute. It's not a means to get there. It's a means to stop getting there and stay on the cusp. But the cusp cannot entertain cuspness forever, because you can only do two things in the pursuit of or in staying on that cusp. You either go towards the absolute and transcend the cusp, or you move away from the absolute back into the relative, because it's a fence sitting, and fence sitting is not a stable position. You're either going away from the cusp towards the absolute or away from the cusp towards the relative, because both options are available to the cusp. And that's why the absolute can manifest itself through the cusp between itself and the relative by expressing the absolute in the format of life force, which is the correct interpretation of electricity, because free energy actually is what the Frankenstein monster should have been given in order to come to life from being a dead corpse, because free energy is that aspect of electricity that does not harm and instead supports the life breath, while electricity is the consequential aspect of the life force that actually ages the creature and eventually kills it. So that we're taught, no, it's the telomeres, the ends of the DNA coming apart. And that's the consequence of being electrocuted. It's going to destroy your DNA and age you and cause you to die because of the excessive use of current, which most people don't know. You have to use nanoamps for current to do the opposite, not to kill you, but to heal you and regenerate you. But they don't know that how moderate you have to be in your use of current in order not to age yourself in the direction of death, but instead regenerate you. So most people don't know that, and so in order to talk to most people, you have to give them overly simplified renditions, which is what Maharishi did when he admonished the teachers of TM that current is bad for the body in any case. And he might have said that because it takes them off the path of TM and puts them on a different path, but it does not harm the body when it's low enough. That I know. That's a scientific fact. It actually regenerates the body when it's low. The current is low enough, because current is the only part of electricity that's damaging to the physiology. But it is a different path, and it's not the path of transcendental meditation. So I can see why Maharishi would admonish the TM teachers on both counts. The count of common sense that is erroneous concerning current, to make a blanket statement that all current is bad for you passing through the body, and on the standpoint of yoga, that TMers are on the path of TM and they're not on some other path, and so why jump around between paths. You'll never reach enlightenment that way. You've got to stick to one path and stick it out for the whole duration. Well, I don't do experiments with body electricity anymore. I only did them when I left LA. And before I left Washington State, I stopped doing them. So I was already setting myself up to return to Southern California by not doing them anymore. Because I had pretty much satisfied myself that a biocircuit plugged into a tree, not into a battery, and plugged into myself can be used as a method for transcending, for inducing transcendental consciousness. And I proved to my satisfaction that it can be done by simply using a circuit rather than a mantra. And it was because it was 2.5 hours of induced samadhi, and I'm really impressed that I was able to do that, but only because I was already on the path of TM, because I was born with these faculties of intuitive study of anything I wished to study and getting answers, made it possible for me to create a biocircuit, a psionic circuit that could induce transcendental consciousness for 2.5 hours without the use of, and that was it. It was not without the use of the mantra. It was instead of it, because I was filled with so much anxiety, I really couldn't meditate anymore. All I could do was unstress. I couldn't transcend. So that was my way. So I can see why it was a grace of God to give me that knowledge so that I could at least transcend one time. And I actually transcended twice while I was in Washington State for 2 years. One time during meditation and one time during my sessions with the biocircuit. It was an enhanced biocircuit because I'm an inventor. I can come up with enhancements and improvements to things that are scientific oriented. But yoga is normally not science oriented. It's mantra oriented. It's subjective science, which is outside my field. I don't understand it. I'm not a TM teacher, so it's really none of my business to prognosticate or teach yogic techniques for transcending, because they're not my domain. And sharing with you the Levitation Sutra is simply repeating what I understand from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It has nothing to do with meditation. It's the sidebar of meditation it's the sidebar of the pursuit of yoga without being the pursuit of yoga itself. Anyway, boy, I'm segueing on a lot of sidebars. So borax is a segue. It's not the pursuit of TM, but it is the pursuit of yoga, though. And it does help. It's a form of cleansing because it is a water softener, so it makes it possible for water to cleanse the body, water alone, which normally water cannot, because water is normally hard. Hard water, earth water, is normally hard water with all kinds of calcium in it, making it difficult to wash when that calcium and magnesium is present, because calcium, I'm not so sure about the magnesium, but calcium in particular makes it harder. And so we invented soap to soften the water, but borax is a mild form of soap. And it's a substitute for soap, which is fine with me. I like mild substitutes, but does require the presence of salt in order to not impact the physiology in an absurd manner. But still, it is a substitute for salt. And so I guess that's why it's tolerable by the path of yoga, because the real use of borax is as a substitute for soap. And we don't eat soap, we eat food. So it makes sense that I would find a substitute for having to ingest borax as a homeless person. But that doesn't mean it's such that I would not use it as a cleansing agent exterior to the body, on the skin. And whether or not it's within the soap, the liquid soap, such as the castile soap recipe that I made by simply adding water with borax pre-dissolved to dilute down the Bronner's liquid castile soap. I'd rather take a bath, but because it makes the borax more effective when you spend time. You really have to soak in a bath to get the benefits of inorganic compounds absorbed into the skin, because it's a very slow process, that absorption. And for it to do any good in modifying the chemistry of the lymphatic fluid, you really have to soak in the bath for quite a while, like half an hour minimum. The longer the better, though. I was able to fast by soaking in the bathtub for 5 hours because it made it possible to arrest my appetite with nothing in the water, just bath water. 5 hours in the bath water made it very easy for me to fast because it just arrested my appetite. But I usually don't do that because it's boring. I usually spend 90 minutes in the bath, give or take. A half hour, give or take, because that's a good maintenance dosage of the bath protocol for me. But in the case of borax, in the case of my condition, and the good that borax does when combined with salt, I found that twice a day was a necessity. And I wouldn't stay in 90 minutes. I'd usually stay in an hour, so that I do my 2 hours a day, which is fine. It's just what I need to stay healthy. But now I have to do the best I can without it. And so this has been a good opportunity for me to find other techniques and not rely on bathing alone, because I really have to pay attention to diet, because I was not paying attention to diet when I was in the apartment, and the aging process was taking over. And I thought that was my fate, but it was really sloth and ignorance on my part that brought on that attitude. And, it has a lot to do with the antifreeze wearing down my body, basically, at an accelerated pace. So I have my reasons for maintaining my use of borax, but only under proper circumstances, which is bathing is the only appropriate circumstance for making use of it. Now I don't have to ingest it, which is really awesome. So nudity for me is not sexuality. It's not the common sense interpretation of sexuality. It's always been an attempt to avoid masturbation, put it off as long as possible, because that was the only sex I've ever known, really. But it still does pertain to sexual activity in general, whether or not it's one form of sexual activity or another, because that's the interpretation of nudity from the standpoint of a child, is the joy of the potentiality for sex without actually engaging in it, without actually having to think about it, as one would normally not think about it as a child. So I felt the necessity for making this recording because most people don't understand what nudity is all about. And I felt the necessity to explain nudity from the standpoint of a nudist's standpoint who grew up that way from childhood on, because that is the more correct interpretation and not the type that we are brainwashed to believe. Because sexual activity is good for business, but it's not good for the nudist. And it's the wrong interpretation. Just like free energy is incorrectly interpreted, likewise, nudity is also misinterpreted. And that's why I pursue these things, because I feel the need to teach people what they incorrectly interpret, what they are incorrectly programmed to think in terms of, which these brainwashings that are so-called common sense maintain ignorance. And I don't uphold that. Maintaining ignorance is not duty-bound to the path of yoga. If anything, yoga is the opposite of ignorance, because a person is engaged in a pathway in which they become more and more aware and awake of themselves, their absolute divine self. So ignorance is the last thing on my plate of intentions. That's the last thing I would want, is to fall into a state of ignorance, regardless of circumstance, because it's just not worth it. There is nothing, not even staying alive, that makes ignorance worthwhile. Not at all. Anyway, my devotion to TM is really my devotion to Charlie over many lifetimes, and my devotion to public service, which is actually antagonistic to yoga, because you're supposed to be selfish when you're a yogi, and I'm not selfish, unfortunately. So that is really the only thing that stands in my way, is my lack of selfishness. And that's what I need help with. Because I have so much self-doubt. I lack the confidence to stick with the path of yoga and be upholding of my devotion to yoga completely all the way, without faltering at the very end, which is the toughest part. Is the cusp, is the transition into enlightenment, full enlightenment, is passing through the cusp and getting past it. And I have yet to get past it. I've passed through it. I passed into it countless times. It's innumerable. It's probably thousands of times by this point. But I never allow it to go all the way, because I keep, out of insecurity, I keep holding on to my mortality. Anyway, so anyway, that I think terminates this. I've said enough. I had to explain nudity from the standpoint of a nudist, from the standpoint of a child nudist, which I am, because that's the only way to interpret it. But as a homeless person, of course, I can't do that, because I'm subjected to a non-private life, because I'm subjected to common sense, which has false notions of what nudity means. So I'm forced into the state of common sense ignorance on the topic of nudity by being homeless. And I think that was my trustee's intentions, because she's like everyone else and doesn't approve of my nudity. So why on earth would she want me to get back together again with my son, utilizing the finances of the trust to pay for a lawyer to reunite with my son? Because that's the last thing she wanted me to do, was to engage my son in my style of life, because of her own misinterpretation and ignorance, and driven by passion. That's the way evil works, driven by both a combination of passion combined with ignorance. Evil flourishes only for that reason, or that pair of reasons. And so she stole money from my mother's trust on that predicate, because of a phone conversation I had with her, in which I fully admitted my intentions of raising my son along my lines of lifestyle. And she doesn't approve of that. And most people do not. Even my ex did not either. Because most people don't appreciate, they don't understand what nudity is about. Yeah, you could have sex with somebody if you're naked all the time, but that doesn't mean you have to. You're not compelled to. It's not expected that you do. So they don't understand that legitimacy of potency. They think it's they don't think of it as a possibility. They think of it as a probability of sexual activity, and that's the distinction. It may seem like a fine distinction of no merit, but it is everything to do with the correct interpretation of nudity. Is the possibility, not the probability. Anyway, okay, now I've said enough.